Great. Thanks ever so much. And Chloe, that's great. Also, thanks ever so much for the big turnout as well. It's great to see so many people here. My name's Steve Smith. I'm from USW, if you don't know, University of South Wales, and I'm also one of the co-directors in Wizard. But what I'm wanting to do here is just basically, I'll be chairing the first two papers and giving the third paper. So just to remind ourselves as to what the title is, and I thought I'd just give a little bit of context as to how this has come about, this particular workshop, symposium, whatever you want to call it, in relation to the summer series. But I also want to outline as well initiative that's been taken by Wizard in terms of setting up a well-being network, which I want to say something a little bit about first before we start going into the papers. I'm going to try and build into today's session a 5-minute break after the second paper, probably. But the format of this is going to be about 20-25 minutes presenting, and then hopefully 5 or 10 minutes then for questions. And please don't be shy. It's really important, obviously, for all of us that you engage with asking questions in relation to each paper. And then hopefully then we'll have a time, as I say, for a 5-minute break to finish promptly at 3 o'clock. Before I start, though, just want to say that this whole session is going to be recorded. So we're kind of assuming that people are okay with that, but it's important, obviously, to say this at the start, just to recognise the fact that it will be recorded and be made available, via the Wizard website and the rest. Okay, so just in terms of explaining what the symposium of papers is about, as you know, the central theme that we're looking at is well-being and social participation. And of course, we know that well-being is a very hot subject in relation to the political context in which it's evolved from, in relation to the Welsh government particularly, but also globally as well. But we wanted to examine well-being and social participation as it related to a number of different areas, notably cultural engagement, and in particular the film industry, also education as well, and in particular higher education and adult returners coming back to education. And finally, the third paper will be focusing on health and in particular social prescription and social prescribing, what that means and how that relates to social well-being. So just in terms of giving you some context, this came out of, in terms of where we're coming from, all of us are academics from the University of South Wales, but it came out of a workshop that we organised prior to lockdown. So it seems like 2 centuries ago now, but it was at the beginning of 2020, where we had a workshop across the institution where we tried to encourage interdisciplinary discussions around well-being research. That was the primary aim of the workshop, and this set of papers came out of that workshop basically. So just to give you some context. The other thing to say as well, as I mentioned earlier, we are using this platform, an official platform, to launch what Wizard are calling a well-being network, which I've been asked to lead, which I'm obviously very happy and feel privileged to do so. But this wellbeing network will be primarily focusing on encouraging interdisciplinary research around wellbeing, so cutting across different disciplines in the social sciences and the health sciences, but also in the political sciences and political philosophy and other areas as well, psychology and the rest, which will hopefully bring some kind of coherence to some of the research that's happening around well-being, particularly interdisciplinary research around well-being across Wales, but also further afield as well. So I'm just using this as an opportunity to officially launch this network and to just flag up that if you are interested in participating in that network, please feel free to email me or contact me via Wizard. Chloe said that she's going to be able to collate anybody who's interested in joining this network. And so I'm at the beginnings now, beginning to gather people's names who might be interested. We're wanting to engage primarily in the first instance academics, but we're also wanting to interface with the policy community as well as practitioners. So if you come under any of those categories, please don't think the Wellbeing Network will be excluding you. We're wanting to encourage, part of our remit is to encourage a dialogue between interdisciplinary research in relation to wellbeing, but also the policy community, policy recommendation community, but also other communities as well, including practitioners, but also service users and the rest. So I won't say much more about that. I'm just conscious of time, but as I say, if you are interested in joining us in that network as a way of encouraging this kind of conversation, if you like, between research around wellbeing and the policy and practice community, then please contact Chloe or myself directly. My email address will be available through Wizard. So, I look forward to hearing from you, basically. Okay, so I won't say much more other than to introduce the first paper, which will be centering around cultural engagement. And this will be delivered by James Rendell, who is engaged in interdisciplinary research in relation to wellbeing, looking at the character and examining what is called, or what many people call, dementia-friendly cinema screenings and their audiences. And what he's going to be doing in his paper is examining these events and how it supports well-being, and also this idea of inclusivity and sociability as well in the context of developing dementia-friendly cinema screenings. So I'll just hand over to James. And as I say, when James finishes his paper, we will have a chance for questions. And just to stress again, it's really important that you're not being shy about coming forward with this. Use the chat line as questions, but also obviously stick your hand up virtually, as it were, and we can organise any discussion around James's paper. Okay, so over to James. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry. It went fine this morning. Let's try that one more time. There we go. So can everyone see that? There we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So hi everyone. Yeah, so my name's Dr. James Rendell. I'm a lecturer in creative industries at the University of South Wales, and my research generally kind of centres on meaning-making practices and participatory cultures around screen media. And this has recently sort of branched out into looking at areas of inclusivity and thinking about the pandemic in general. So I just want to start with a report on the impact of COVID-19 on people affected by dementia, published last year by the Alzheimer's Society. And they found that from their survey a number of worrying effects. As you can see from the slide there, the most common symptoms that people living with dementia reported having increased since lockdown began with difficulty concentrating, memory loss, and agitation or restlessness. People living with dementia living alone were more likely to report an increase in their symptoms during lockdown compared to those living with others. The most common symptoms that carers reported in their loved ones with dementia that have increased since lockdown began with memory loss, difficulty concentrating, agitation and restlessness, and stress or depression. And carers living with their loved ones with dementia are significantly more likely to notice any increase of new symptoms compared to those living away. The survey also found that nearly half of people living with dementia state that the pandemic has had a negative impact on their mental health, and over 1 in 3 reported having lost confidence in going out and carrying out daily tasks. People living with dementia living alone reported their experience of the pandemic most negatively, with 56% stating they felt lonelier compared to 23% of people living with others reporting this. Several members of people living with dementia mentioned they missed taking part in social functions they attended prior to the lockdown, so things like dementia support groups, those kind of things, and that the restrictions doing this had diminished their confidence further. What's also important is that the pandemic had a strong negative emotional impact on carers as well, with their mental health, added strain to their relationships with their loved ones, and left them struggling with caring for themselves and others. Other areas carers had been negative impact include exhaustion, sadness, and missing loved ones. So what this data highlights then is how important social dynamics, leisure, and inclusion within society are to the well-being of those living with dementia and their carers. And of course, this should be no surprise, as these are all markers of good quality of life that most of us desire. And with this, the presentation explores the role of specialist dementia-friendly cinema in fostering well-being for its patrons. So a brief overview of the method of this paper. Within the study of dementia-friendly cinema, this is an area really lacking comprehensive research. There's really not that much on it. And it would benefit from a holistic conceptualization and synthesis of literature, to quote Tarako. Moreover, given the cessation of face-to-face events, this has stopped, for the time being anyway, employing audience-based primary research methods such as interviews, which I'm looking to sort of do in the future when things become a bit more feasible. As such, at the moment anyway, an integrative literature review was deemed the most suitable methodology to identify key contributions, strengths and weaknesses of the literature, synthesize diverse and disparate studies as methods, sort of interdisciplinary, bringing in dementia studies, leisure studies, and sort of film and media studies, and analyze secondary audience data gleaned from the existing research. So the World Health Organization explains that dementia is a syndrome, usually of a chronic or progressive nature, in which there's a deterioration in cognitive function, i.e. the ability to process thought, beyond what might be expected from normal aging. It affects memory, thinking, orientation, comprehension, calculation, learning capacity, language, and judgment. Consciousness is not affected, and the impairment in cognitive function is commonly accompanied and occasionally preceded by deterioration in emotional control, social behavior, or motivation. Now, the World Health Organization estimates that worldwide, around 50 million people have dementia, with nearly 60% living in low and middle income countries. Every year, there are nearly 10 million new cases, and the total number of people with dementia is projected to reach 82 million in 2030, 152 million in 2050. Furthermore, Wittenberg et al. Estimate that there are almost 885,000 older people with dementia in the UK in 2019. So with no known cure for dementia, focus has shifted to the well-being of those with dementia, who often report feeling a loss of status as a competent social partner, a loss of social or social familial ties, and difficult feelings in social situations, to quote Morrissey et al. With this, a person-centered model focuses on aiding people with dementia and their carers to maintain a degree of living well. One way to encourage well-being is through partaking in meaningful leisure activities. As Jodrell and Smith explain, interest in leisure activity does not have to go away when people have dementia. Indeed, there is a huge need for something enjoyable and rewarding to do during the day, particularly activities that are social or can be carried out independently. Leisure activities serve a range of important functions for those with dementia and the other people in their lives. They're valuable for social inclusivity, providing independence and agency, intellectual stimulation, and protection against cognitive decline. And it's also taken for granted that leisure fosters pleasure and reminds us of the fact that enjoyment is an important aspect of well-being. This stresses the importance of relaxation and enjoyment through entertainment, to quote Nygaard et al. Consequently, as the Alzheimer's Society indicates, for a person living with dementia, watching a film in the cinema has many benefits. It can promote activity and stimulation in mind, can be an important tool for reminiscence, and is associated with relaxation, engagement, and above all, enjoyment. So cinema going is a leisure activity perceived to be for all social demographics, fostering repetitive and ritualized engagement with film, and a meaningful leisure resource or practice that those with dementia want access to. However, specialized or non-standardized programming highlights a recognition that various groups are not well served by regular cinema, to quote Boyle. Particularly, people with dementia are likely to be stigmatized because of their out of the ordinary or problematic behavior that challenge social norms regarding appropriate conduct, to quote Bond and Corner. Common etiquette of British standard cinema attendants habitually ask patrons to sit quietly and to engage with one another minimally. This context could be stressful, embarrassing, stigmatizing, and exclusionary for those with dementia. As the Alzheimer's Society reports, cinemas don't always make accessible or supportive environments for people affected by dementia. According to their recent survey, 69% of people with dementia said that the main reason they stopped going out is a lack of confidence. Therefore, homogenized cinema spaces can produce an environment that is non-inclusive to all audiences. So Bhatt et al. Explained that going to the cinema is usually one of the cultural activities people have easy access to, but it can become a real challenge for individuals with dementia. Too late presentations, too long sessions, content not suitable for the audience. These hurdles can become difficult to overcome. We could also add to this the process of ticket acquisition, especially if technology is required, self-service ticket machines, payments requiring remembering a code or PIN, and or pre-ordering tickets via computer, can produce barriers and feelings that prevent persons with dementia attending cinemas. Now, this is not to say that caregivers cannot support them, but these issues can reduce a person's independence and increase levels of stigmatization. So whilst Bhatt et al.'s work raises important considerations, their study focuses on organizing film sessions rather than investigating those with dementia and their experience on cinema attendance. Britton et al.'s research into dementia-friendly cinema used thought clouds that allowed audiences to express their thoughts and feelings about the scheme, capturing snippets of feedback straight after the film was shown. Their results highlight the salience of physical space, the ambience, and the role of staff in meeting care needs, evidencing scope for deeper levels of audience response that can be located in wider meaning-making practices. Indeed, as Yankovic et al. State, cinema going is about far more than watching a film. Therefore, there's a need to think about dementia-friendly cinema attendance and examine their experiences before, during, and after the screenings, the socio-spatial environments, and what aspects the attendees found easy, enjoyable, difficult, and or unpleasant. So the focus on environmental and social conditions that enable audiences to enjoy experiences have been addressed by the growing field of experiential cinema events. This is, to quote Atkinson and Kennedy, cinema that escapes beyond the boundaries of the auditorium, whereby film screenings are augmented by synchronous live performance, site-specific locations, technological intervention, social media engagement, and all manner of simultaneous interactive moments, including singing, dancing, eating, drinking, and smelling. Atkinson and Kennedy note the popularity in non-traditional cinema events has expanded in response to the public's love for nostalgia and the power of fan engagement, with many events tending to be about old and well-loved film releases. Here, they argue nostalgia features a key facet of the experiential cinema register of engagement, allowing audiences to make a deeper emotional engagement with the film by engaging in new or novel ways. Where limited research has touched upon people with dementia in cinema, nostalgia has been a recurring response to screenings of older titles, where attendees gain pleasure reminiscing about the past. Consequently, attending the cinema can allow attendees to reconnect with significant autobiographical events whilst catering to their newer needs, as this quote indicates by Merrick et al. So as this quote demonstrates, when reminiscing about the past with loved ones, the cinema was a salient site for recollection. Many couples talked about the development of their relationship, recalling the story of their first meeting. Despite the memory difficulties, people with dementia were often able to recall this. Reminiscing with warmth and fondness, Cyril shared his memories of his first date with his wife. He says, our friends were going to the cinema. It was during the war. They were all in pairs, so we were in a pair. The film we went to see was We Dive at Dawn, wartime film. We went to the cinema and I took her home in the blackout. I summoned up all my courage and I kissed her on the cheek and ran away. So in this instance, going to the cinema had a deeper meaning because it was where Cyril went on his romantic outing with his now wife and their friends. Wendy, another person living with dementia, explains that Chitty Chitty Bang Bang reminds me so much of watching the film time and time again with my daughters. In this example, the repetition of watching the same film over and over again has strong connections not just to the film, but the shared repeated experience as a familial pastime that evokes a strong sense of nostalgia. Cinema, in this case, to borrow Astrid Earle's term, can be thought of as a medium of memory that has a material as well as a social dimension. The former reflected in the filmic texts that were consumed in important parts of people's lives, such as We Dive at Dawn and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and the latter with whom we watch or rewatch texts, which gives meaning to our memories or indeed makes these events memorized. Dementia-friendly cinema provokes media cues that entwine with our autobiographical memories that, far from homogeneous, allow the individual to be rarefied. Now, that being said, it's worth highlighting that some patrons with dementia and their carers object to the label dementia-friendly because they find it exclusionary. Respondents in Morrissey et al. Study found the term marginalizing as they view it as they view it as further secluding people with dementia to special places where they can be with people like themselves. Yet many others welcomed the dementia-friendly cinema initiative, and an evaluation of the cinema screens yielded some extremely positive feedback, again to quote Morrissey et al. Yet part of the discussion centers on film selection. Whilst nostalgia for films from yesteryear can have a positive effect for some, others found issue with the prevalence of old films and Disney's children movies, as they felt these screenings patronized them as an audience. Those living with dementia, as with all audiences, can find effective pleasure and cultural value in cinema going, providing variety that enriches their lives with the latest films. So, for example, from these quotes, as the first one says, it's selective what we pick to watch, happy ending ones, the feel-good factor. It's a change, a form of escapism, and a meaning of getting out. As one carer says about their partner, she struggles to recall seeing the film afterwards, but she enjoys the experience, and it's lovely to see her show some spark and inkling of understanding. Similarly, another carer says, my husband's dementia has excluded us from many activities, but with dementia screenings, we feel safe enough to enjoy going to the cinema again. It's been liberating for us both as we cope with this isolating illness. So as we can see from the last quote, part of the effective enjoyment that comes from immersing ourselves into cinema is the ability to allow ourselves to relax and become enthralled with the audiovisual text. Standardized cinema context can block this because of the reasons previously highlighted, causing those living with dementia and those accompanying them a lack of effective pleasure. Dementia-friendly screenings, through their shifting exhibition and social context, thus can facilitate immersive joy, both in the film itself and in being an audience member. This is facilitated by the auditorium being adapted to be as calming and comfortable as possible. Seats can be removed to make space for wheelchairs. Lights are dim so people can move around. The volume slightly lower, and chatting or singing along is not met by pleas of silence, to quote Purvis. Dementia-friendly screens also tend to remove adverts prior to the film so as not to distract or confuse the audience. And given that there is also a strong evidence of a link between hearing loss and dementia, to quote Lundy et al., the use of soft subtitles can also support audiences to follow and enjoy films and include those who are deaf and living with dementia. Moreover, reduced ticket prices support attendance for people with dementia and their caregivers, and providing training for staff in spaces where dementia-friendly cinema screens are housed also benefits patrons' experiences and encourages the probability of return to subsequent screenings. Indeed, certain types of screenings also encourage audience social engagement, namely sing-along cinema. The Alzheimer's Society have found that classic musicals are particularly popular, and music and song often stay with people when other forms of communication are no longer possible, allowing people with dementia and their family members to still enjoy a shared experience. Sing has been used both as a leisure activity and music treatment for persons with dementia, providing parallels to research into sing-along cinema. And as this quote indicates, we laughed and we've cried, we've sung, and we even got up in the aisle and danced. And I really like this quote, particularly the second part, where effective pleasure is not just from watching the film, but through social active engagement, which forms part of the cinematic experience. Thus, in contrast to often highly structured and standardized conventional cinema going, which as highlights those living with dementia can find unpleasurable, dementia-friendly cinema, I argue, evokes a sight of communitas. Now, Edith's term defines communitas as a group's pleasure in sharing common experience with one's fellows. Turner sees liminal sites of laughter and play as evoking communitas, of which she includes the pantomime. As demonstrated from the quote, these are also core aspects of pleasure of dementia-friendly cinema screenings. Turner also argues that communitas may be found when people engage in a collective task with full attention, often a matter of ordinary work. And this can be seen in the following quotes. So as the first one indicates, at the White Christmas screening in South London recently, Em and her mother Aisha enjoyed the film, but also enjoyed the opportunity to come to a place where people understand how the disease can affect people, referring to dementia there. Em says Aisha gets a lot out of them. When we stay indoors at home, keeping her active is harder, and she tends to sleep a lot. But when we come here, she's wide awake and the brain is stimulated. It keeps her going. As the second quote indicates, a trip to the cinema is a rare chance for people with dementia to participate in a normal activity and not be reminded of their dementia. And this is sort of echoed by those observing attendees. As one informal carer says, I think for me it's a time to relax. I can switch off for half an hour or so and just watch him and know that he's enjoying himself. As another says, it's nice for me to relax as well. You know, I'm not on his guard as much as I used to be, so I'm relaxing as well. So dementia-friendly cinema's facilitation of normalness allows attendees to fully engage with the leisure experience in and of itself, rather than be reminded of social identity markers that in certain situations, such as standard cinema screenings, heighten these identities to the point of othering and creating negative feelings. In this sense, dementia-friendly screenings as communitas allow people to just be. They are both specialized experiential events, but paradoxically also sites of normalizing affective pleasure. Moreover, these social aspects are not limited to the screening itself. So even if the film is not entirely pleasurable, the experience of attending the cinema with others as a leisure activity can be. As Harvard argues, beyond standardized movie spaces, particular film cultures develop within specific institutional and social spaces and connect to larger networks of socialization. Independent and local exhibition may provide dementia-friendly cinemas as part of their wider socio-political goals, as community hubs and dementia-friendly environments. For example, at Chapter Cinema in Cardiff, tea and biscuits are offered after screenings to encourage audiences to stay and talk in a relaxed and friendly environment. Likewise, cinema going can provide social pleasures. So Lopez Sinet et al. Write that when consumption of film occurs in a cinema, other individuals interact in the co-production of the experience. Now, they identify two types of co-producers. The first group is composed of people with strong social and personal links, namely partners, family, friends, etc. As indicated from the previous quotes, dementia-friendly cinema often engages with this primary group, where those living with dementia attend screenings with their family, friends, or carers. The second group of co-producers are the strangers who share the cinema, the experience, and the film, most particularly when there is a sharing of key moments depicted in the film. To quote Lopez Sinet et al. Resultantly, they argue co-producers of the movie experience interpret it according to their own accumulated experience, their subjectivities, their personal needs, and their socially produced symbolic meanings. So alongside watching movies and as a communitas event, cinema attendance can stimulate socializing and provide key talking points after screenings, as exemplified in the following quote. So this quote is from Keith Oliver, a retired head teacher living with dementia. And Keith says, not only does it offer a social activity, but it also gives people with dementia an opportunity to really engage with the cinema and with each other. The format of each screening is always the same: show the film, have tea, coffee, and refreshments, and then split into groups for discussion. The discussions incorporate visual prompts for participants. The discussion group never attempts to go over the plot of the film. They aim to draw on the emotions the film engendered in people. Discussion was often around the characters or the themes. For example, The King's Speech provoked interesting discussion about dementia as an invisible disability compared to the King's very visible one. For its part, Paddington brought up issues of family dynamics and even provoked debate about refugees and the movement of people. Now, socializing and community talk can also extend to discussions that are not directly related to the film screened, as this quote highlights. Screenings like this are a way to meet fellow caregivers and volunteers and to find a community of people who are also going through the same struggles. Consequently, dementia-friendly cinema fosters space for carers and family members to meet others like them and to talk through their experiences. In doing so, people can feel less isolated and alone, which, combined with the regularity of weekly screenings, can engender meaningful social networks that support well-being for all attendees. So to conclude, as demonstrated, dementia-friendly cinema as a medium of memory, source of effective pleasure, communitist event, and a site for social networks to grow is an important leisure activity with myriad qualities for well-being for all those who attend. But as indicated by the study at the beginning of my talk, the pandemic cessation of face-to-face events, alongside the closing of cinema houses and similar public spaces, of which Cineworld being one of the largest examples, can result in a detriment for those living with dementia and their carers and families' well-being, as they cannot attend dementia-friendly cinema screenings during or even after the pandemic. As such, dementia-friendly cinema warrants further scholarly attention and wider support for their upkeep to help facilitate social inclusion, pleasure, and ultimately better serve dementia-friendly communities. Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, James. That's a fascinating paper. There's so many interesting issues there about the character of well-being, the relationship between emotion and social environments and the rest. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. So just open it up to people. If you want to put your hand up virtually, I can track where people are at in relation to the participant list. Or if you want to put a question in the chat line, it's up to you. But please don't be shy in coming forward. And if you have any questions for James and his exploration of dementia-friendly cinema screenings. We have a question from Bernadette. So would you like to ask your question, Bernadette?
Yeah, hi, thank you, James. My question was, I was really impressed, so thank you. I think it's really important that people are paying so much attention to that, especially for the caregivers as well. The shared experience for them too is just as important. And I was recognising that for other people with other invisible disabilities, such as ASD and brain injury and things, a similar set of circumstances would be very helpful to them too. And I just wondered if you're working with other colleagues who are sort of following the same, example as you, and putting it across other experiences.
That's a very good question. Yeah, so this is still, this sort of research started pre-pandemic, and there was big lofty hopes of being able to collaborate with many different people, many different researchers, and many different industry or sort of wider stakeholders. Obviously, the pandemic has stopped that for the moment anyway, or sort of reduced its capacity. But I think one of the things you highlight really well is that a lot of work in film and media studies, and even in media audience studies, tends to kind of assume a homogenous audience, or when we look at audience identity anyway, and when we look at sort of variation, that it tends to cut across I guess more standard ideas of intersectionality, so things like gender and race and sexuality. When it comes to disability or other types of things, these tend to get neglected, particularly if they're invisible. And so I guess the short answer is no, I haven't reached out to other people, but it's certainly an area that I want to look at, is different types of cinema screenings. For example, I know there are sort of autism-friendly cinema screenings in sort of pockets and areas, and this is one of the things that comes up, as Hubbard's quote kind of indicates, is this tends to operate at a kind of quite, I guess, a grassroots level, or kind of local community level in certain places, rather than, say, the big mainstream cinemas. But it's definitely, I think, part of the research aim is that to sort of prompt this to sort of have more, shed light on it, and then hopefully more of these screenings can come about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I can imagine you've been able to work with other people, and together it tends to get more things noticed.
Yeah, definitely. For this kind of thing, collaboration would be key. Yeah.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. Well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Bernadette. So we've got two Sallys now. So if we could start with Sally Reese, you put her hand up first. So Sally Reese, would you like to ask a question of James then?
Hi, Steve. Nice to see you as well. Yeah, I've just posted actually as as James was talking about, other showings for other groups of children, young people and adults, particularly those with autism, and they've been well established, as you say, probably in pockets. I know Contact Family, as is now Contact, did quite a lot of work with the Odeon cinemas for specific showings so that children and young people could move around, they didn't have to stay in their seats. And similarly, Theatre Clwyd, for example, would do specific showings of the pantomime each year, the rock and roll panto. So there are good examples of that. I think what struck me about this particular piece of research, and it sort of resonates with me personally, so a lot of the things that have been said sort of really struck home around how you can connect with a family member through film and through reminiscing through films, and how powerful that can be. In my case, it was with Hollywood musicals, and you had some of those pictures on the screen. That my mother in particular loved those, particularly My Fair Lady, and then started talking with a Cockney accent, albeit she'd come from South London, but not within the sound of Bow Bells, and how staff interacted with her on that basis, but also how she found that funny, that they thought she was funny because she was speaking slightly differently, but then they could still continue those interactions about what it was like, where she was living when she was younger. So it has knock-on effects, doesn't it, from the cinema showing itself. But a really excellent piece of work, and thank you for presenting today, James.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thanks, Sally. So Sally, second Sally, Sally Power.
Thanks very much, James. I mean, I think you make a really convincing case about why dementia-friendly cinema is very helpful to those who attend it, but I also feel a bit uneasy about it in some ways. I mean, we've already heard that you might, there's other particular groups with invisible disabilities as well as those with physical disabilities, and I kind of worry that you might end up with a very fragmented provision for excluded groups, and it raises bigger questions about well-being and questions to do with that's been going on in disability studies for a long time about whether in actually to support disabled people with disabilities or dementia, you actually give them specialist separate provision, or actually whether you promote better well-being by working on the context in which they live so that they're not isolated. And I say that in the sense that I don't really want to go to the cinema and hear lots of other noise, but it may be that we have to manage our own expectations of what going to the cinema is rather than putting people into a different venue.
I completely agree. I think that's a good point. And as part of the sort of previous research has indicated that a number of people with dementia and their carers are quite object to the term dementia friendly because the well-being the sort of meaning well around that term, but actually they find it exclusionary, that they want to be, they don't want to be special. I think they want to be involved in what everyone else is involved in and sort of facilitating that. The quote from Keith Oliver, he goes on and talks about that when they were setting up their specialist screening, they initially didn't call it dementia-friendly cinema. I think they just called it something like relaxed or inclusive screenings. And what they found was that people weren't turning to these events. They were almost a bit too vague. So then they started using dementia-friendly as part of their title, and that encouraged people to go. But I think you're right, and I think it off the back of Bernadette's point as well, is that maybe this is more about the standardized, homogenized events that are perhaps exclusionary. There was a report that there was a screening at the BFI, and I think it was a musical or something, and one of the attendees had autism and was loving the film. It was their favorite film. They were really immersed, they were really enthralled, they were engaging with it. And the way that they were presenting that was being very vocal, shouting the quotes back and all that kind of things that we see in things like experiential cinema. If you go to a sing-along movie, or if you go to like a Rocky Horror Picture show midnight screening where people are kind of exuberant and rambunctious, those things are kind of celebrated. But in this BFI screening, that was deemed inappropriate, and the attendee was asked to leave, and they were really upset because they felt that they'd not only upset other people, but they'd ruined their time for them. So yeah, there's definitely the way that it's negotiated, I think, is certainly important, both within these specialist events, but also, as you say, more inclusive events in general. Good point to consider. Thanks for that.
Thanks for that question, Sally. We've probably got one more time. We've got a bit of time for one more question. Ian, you put your hand up, so I just wondered if you've got a quickish question that you could ask.
Yeah, and again, James, thanks for the presentation. My question was your projected numbers for 2030 up to 2050, the huge jump. Is that, do we know any reason behind that, or is it just the people living longer, or?
Possibly, yeah. These are numbers that were stats that were from the World Health Organization. Possibly people living longer. There's a lot of research around potentially sort of trying to deal with it, but I guess because there's no cure for it, the focus on rather than cure is sort of how can people live with it and still have meaningful and fulfilling lives and stuff like that. And I think that's the thing, that we often think of a cinema or just watching a movie as maybe kind of frivolous or kind of throwaway, and actually pleasure and things like that are really important to our well-being, and particularly, during the pandemic. I mean, there's no coincidence that things like subscriptions to Netflix went up huge during the pandemic because people wanted escapism and to immerse themselves in other things. So, but yeah, I'm not too sure about the kind of specifics of the kind of medical side of why they think dementia's going up.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, James, and thank you very much for the questions as well. I'm sure this debate will go on in various different forms and many different offshooting questions as well. But just moving swiftly on, as it were, under the heading still, obviously, of well-being and social participation, we now have a presentation from Marie Clifford and Emma Wheeler, and their research is concerned with the well-being of foundation year students in higher education. And they are specialists working within what you might call non-traditional learners, and they focus on the pedagogical implications of learning being facilitated within an interdisciplinary teaching team. So I'll hand over to Marie and to Emma, and then we'll do the same questions at the end of the presentation. Thanks.
Oh, thanks very much, Steve. I'll get our slide shower. Okay, so this is Emma and I's presentation. I mean, all details on the slide there if you want to get in touch with us for any particular reason. And what we felt was really important when looking at non-traditional learners is it's not just about the outcomes that are achieved, it's also about the journey that they go on and the support and awareness there is around students. There's a copy of our abstract, which again, we're looking at how we can take maybe a different approach to delivering material with a very strong focus on well-being, and in particular, having a trauma-informed understanding of where our students may be coming from. Tell you a little bit about foundation year, if you don't know what foundation year is. It's often referred to as a year zero programme in universities. It's often for students who do not have the normal entry requirements. So they may not have A-levels, for example, but they may be mature students. So you can see the average age of our foundation year students is 24. Often they can be from non-traditional backgrounds. They're more likely to be from low participation areas. They're more likely to be first in their family to have attended university. A higher proportion have got additional learning needs. So that's 17% of our students have additional learning needs. That's compared to about 6% of the general university population. And we'd absolutely take an interdisciplinary approach. We work across the university. We work closely with library staff, careers staff, study support staff, in order to make sure that students get supported at various points along their first year at university. So if I start by telling you a little bit about my current research, I'm about 2/3 of the way through my PhD, so I'm hoping that's going to be coming to an end in about 18 months' time. And I'm doing this through 3 different action research cycles. I'm focusing on what benefits students gain from studying on a foundation year programme and from studying in higher education in general. And I'm not only focusing on aspects such as the grades they come out with or how much they potentially might earn. I'm also looking at the well-being aspects of that. I very much take a participatory view. The students they drive the research. Each of the action research cycles has been based on what has come previously from the students' feedback. And the 3rd cycle is going to be very much a co-production cycle based on what the students have got to say. And I also come from a constructivist point of view with my research, in that I feel the students can provide rich, detailed information, and it's important to listen to what they're saying rather than just going by the status quo and presuming, business as usual. I'll hand over to Emma.
Hi there. So I've been teaching on the foundation year programme at the University of South Wales with Marie. I think I've been doing that for about 12 years now, and working in the Workers' Educational Association in community venues prior to that. My research began, I started thinking about my PhD about 5 years ago, and it came through the favourite part of my job, which is personal tutoring. And I discovered that many of our foundation year students had additional learning needs. And in addition to that, it was impacting on their mental health and sense of well-being, and the way that they were approaching student services to access support. And there was quite a lot of avoidance, in fact, in going to get help. And I realised how important that relationship was between tutor and student. And so I began then in about 2017, I think it was, doing a portfolio approach, which is quite, for me, I wanted to take a slow approach to research and use my identity as also an art psychotherapist, and use even though I wasn't teaching art, I was teaching childhood studies and youth and community work and academic study skills. My identity as a part-time art psychotherapist as well meant that I couldn't really take the sugar out of the cake. I couldn't take the artist or the art therapist out of me as a tutor. And I wanted to use those arts approaches to help me in thinking about the needs of dyslexic learners, learners on the autistic spectrum, and generally students who were struggling in the classroom and also struggling with mental health needs. So my theoretical framework is critical pedagogy. I'm very much inspired by looking at the work of Paulo Freire and Augusto Boal from Brazil in the 70s and 80s, and what that might mean now. And also thinking about students in terms of their different backgrounds and stories, what oppression to them might look like, and how we can enable students to feel more empowered and more skilled in bringing transformation into their lives through education. If we could, yeah. So, in terms of arts-based methods, I took a bricolage approach, which is thinking about a quilt, for example, and thinking about multiple tools that I might use in my research journey. Also thinking about my own needs as a learner, being visual, being somebody who likes doing and making. And I was really inspired through my therapy training by Sean McNiff, who is an American art therapist and teaches and trains and writes all about the use of arts for research. And more recently, Ross Pryor, who's edited the book that you can see in this image here, a lot of chapters and authors who write about using the arts. They might be artists, they might be art educators, and also they might not be. They, like Dawn Manet, they might be using creative approaches for a particular purpose in their research, maybe by bringing distance or maybe working with children and young people. So I just wanted to introduce you here to some of the key researchers who talk and think and use creative methods and creative tools in their research. the next slide, please. Here as well are some key texts. So Marie uses a narrative approach. I like storytelling also, and like to approach my whole journey in a storytelling way. Dawn Manet wrote the first book, which I know is something that Marie is using. And the two middle books are ones that I'm drawing on, and I just want to really show you and encourage you in thinking about using the arts in lots of different ways in researchful approaches. So to tell you about my first project, I've got two projects. The first one very much focused on dyslexia, and the second one is focused more on autism and social anxiety. But this first one was a friend of mine, a local artist in Newport. She was awarded an Arts Council of Wales fund to explore for 9 or 10 months her own experiences of dyslexia and how that was impacting her mental health. She invited me to her studio, and it was absolutely incredible to see sculptures, to see the way she was making and using mosaic, to explore herself and where she was at in terms of her own business and how she'd got stuck. So taking on an approach that we use in psychotherapy training, which is a child observation approach, I observed, I looked, I photographed, and I thought about the needs of my foundation year learners and how a lot of what Stephanie Roberts was finding through her art making, I could maybe transfer into the classroom. And so we did a pilot study, a pilot workshop rather, with my foundation year students, and they tried out doodling while they were looking at written text and listening to things read out and listening to lectures, and started to bring more of a doing element into the classroom that they could use alongside listening to recordings. So it was very much looking at this connection between additional needs and mental health. If we could move on to the next slide. We then, for the second year, which was 2018, we invited the public to send us postcards, which were their expressions of their experiences of dyslexia. We held a collaborative exhibition with artists, and we did workshops with the public. And again, all the way through my participatory and observational involvement in this, I exhibited my first peer-reviewed paper and made my own artistic installation. I was finding that there was so much rich learning that I could take back into my classroom in non-art environments. And then Rebecca Hammett, the woman in the bottom left hand, the bottom left of the screen, she is also dyslexic and autistic and is a performance artist, and was there making an appendage over her face and expressing her daily life of using voice recognition software. And she talked about her early experiences of the red marks on a page, and she talked about what life is like for her, having received a diagnosis and coming to terms with what she was being told that she couldn't do and what she needed to be able to do those things. So I was immersing myself in this creative world, but also then transferring that into start gathering stories from my own foundation year learners. So if we move on to the next slide. So I started making origami books and thinking about my voluntary involvement in community oral history projects. So I was involved in one at an interfaith centre in my local community, gathering stories over the last 50 years. And also another oral history project with Welsh Women's Aid. And my involvement in those two projects inspired me to start using audio image recordings, which we use in art psychotherapy as an evaluative tool, and start to meet with my students who had additional learning needs, making books with them, spending an hour with them, listening to their story and recording snippets of that, and making small recordings that were part of my process in helping me to get to know them and their stories in a creative way, and identifying themes that were coming out. So I've got a 4-minute, just over a 4-minute recording that we're going to play now for you of 2 of those very small snippets of 2 stories.
I never accepted the fact that I had dyslexia. I don't think I do now really 100%, but I never really I thought I was struggling until it came to like the parts when I was proper struggling. I thought it was the pressure more than the actual dyslexia itself. I thought it was more that I couldn't handle pressure very well in comparison to the dyslexia. I can read, it just takes me longer. So it's not like I can't do something, I can. It just takes me a bit longer than someone else does.
Yeah. Okay.
At the same time, I don't need you to hold my hand. Like if you told me to do it, and I would have done it, but because you hold my hand, I know I'll get away with not doing it. And I just hated it. I hated someone hold my hand. I think it was a bit. It's more rude. I think it's more offensive than they realise. Because even though you're saying I can't do it, they're just agreeing with you then that you can't do it.
Okay.
Yeah, it was like, oh yeah, you actually can't, can you? And you're like, no. And you're like, all right, they actually genuinely think I can't do it, so what's the point? Anyone who's dyslexic, anyone who's got any learning difficulties can learn. It doesn't mean they can't learn. It's not a wall saying that you're not allowed to pass this wall. You just got to climb over it. And it might be a bit a higher wall than other people have got, but then I think that's what people are forgetting. It's not that you can't do it, it's just harder. So by holding my hand, I guess, it's just always stuck with me because I just thought, right, I don't need to try in this lesson. And I probably should have been trying. And I probably could have done it if I tried a bit harder.
So that's a fun cover. So I tried to sort of put into pictures and some words how I felt like the foundation, how it helped me. So the first bit is confidence, and it sort of gave. So I'm not very good at drawing, but it's supposed to be a little knight with a pen. So sort of confidence in a sort of heroic way. Yeah, I know it sounds weird. So it's building up confidence so you can do sort of heroic things. I know. You're sort of trying to prove people wrong, in a sense. Because my mother has dyslexia, and she was, because they weren't really known about, nobody really spoke about it, and she was called sort of stupid and she would never do anything. You have to sort of pretend, think into naked. So you have to come across as like, I can do this, I can do this, and, sort of ignore the negative things that follow you through childhood. So foundation, it gave me a second chance to do better, where before in like high school, I sort of felt like I couldn't do anything, so I never tried. But then, second chances, you get to do better things, build up confidence and, take a different path. I think, in a sense, it's a two-way thing. Although the system needs to be updated in the sense that dyslexia needs to be more known about, but you can't put it all on the system because you have to work with it, and the system has to work with you in order to move forward. So you, the dyslexic, have to put the effort in to try and change things, and then the system has to allow you to work. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Sorry, everyone, I need to get us back to the right place. Will be a second.
Thanks, Marie.
Okay, so that's where Emma took us up to. So my research is a bit different from Emma, and I'm coming from a slightly different background than Emma. My background is psychology, so lots of quantitative research, and that was kind of what I always presumed my my research life would be about. However, when I started studying the benefits that foundation year students gained from their participation in higher education, I realised that just the numbers wasn't going to illustrate exactly what was going on. So here is, this is about as arty as I get. Here is some of the ways that I've analysed the research. So I've used thematic analysis, and I've tried to do it in a very visual way, which has definitely made me think in a different way than I would normally. So for example, one of the findings that came out of the first piece of research I did, which was based on focus groups, was not only the value that students get from studying at university, but the value that we gain from the students studying with us. And it was something that I hadn't really considered too much before. I knew that I enjoyed teaching and I got a lot from students, but I actually managed to get lots of evidence about how they actually help us, for example, in selling the course, how much they help us welcoming new students to the university, how much they help us by mentoring students. So by using this visual approach and a more creative approach, I discovered information I wouldn't have otherwise discovered. The second round of my research with my PhD, I've been using more narrative research, doing more in-depth interviews with previous foundation year students. And what has struck me is the similarity in their stories. So for example, a large number of our foundation year students have gone through some kind of traumatic event during school. School was often a very difficult time for students. In my piece of research, it was a small sample. There were 10 participants that I interviewed, and of those 10, 8 of them had suffered some kind of trauma during school, either been bullied or had a diagnosed or an undiagnosed additional learning need where they might have been separated from the class or something. So that seemed to be a common theme that's developed. And again, there seemed to be this journey that students would go through. And there seemed to be this journey where the previous experiences would be the starting point. Then they needed that support in order for them to grow and their confidence to grow. And then a lot of our foundation year students felt they wanted to give something back, and they felt they wanted to share the experiences that they'd gained from study. Wellbeing is a huge part of what we do on the foundation year programme. We do teach content, and we do deliver elements that will help them go on to their degree in terms of, for example, maths support for students going on to study business, accounting and psychology. But there's a bigger picture than that, and well-being is a huge part of what we do. So we try to think holistically. We think about where the students have come from, and the research that Emma and I are doing is really helping us see that most of our students have got a story, and there is some reason often why they're studying the foundation year first. Not historically, as people might have presumed, because of some kind of failure. Often something has happened which has meant they couldn't complete their studies. Also thinking holistically from a university point of view, we need to think about how the university together supports students. We need to be responsive. We need to think about what each of our individual students need and how we can help them. And again, we tend to take an approach that is more supportive for all of our students, and we find that that benefits all of them equally. Students, Emma has already mentioned this, often find access and support very difficult. And often on the foundation year programme, something that we will do that often other members of staff may not be as comfortable doing is we'll act as a conduit and help provide that support and put them in touch with people, but actually help them get in touch with those people rather than just passing on an email address, for example. It's really important to think about the demographic of our students. Like I've already mentioned, a higher proportion of our students have got additional needs or a disability. So again, we take an inclusive approach where we attempt and try our best to use those approaches to help all of our students. And Emma and I are both part of a widening participation group at USW, and we're working across the university, and we're working with lots of colleagues, not just academic colleagues, but colleagues from professional services and support services as well. And that's a really important element of what we do, seeing the whole university approach. I'll hand back to Emma.
So thinking visually and metaphorically again, this image is of a Corvid, and he was injured and looked after, nursed at home and fed for 2 weeks, and placed in a little a mesh den or temporary home, which gradually over 2 weeks was expanded more and expanded more, until we felt that he was ready to fly across the field and go on his own. And thinking about our students, quite often they come a little bit injured, as Marie was talking about there, but through thinking from perhaps an attachment theory model, or thinking compassionately, and tutors sensitively responding to our students' needs, we can do similar things. We can validate, we can listen to the stories, we can believe our students and hear them and nurture them into more of an independent way of learning, so that they can survive in the wider university for their longer journey.
This was also an element that I found through my research. This is a quote from one of the students that I spoke to in the interviews I did. I never thought that I'd be accused of being too supportive, but what some of our students found was that the way the foundation year tutors supported them, by emailing back very quickly, by never belittling any of the queries they may have, they didn't find that on their degree necessarily. Again, there's some very good degree lecturers as well who are very supportive, but they didn't find that so much. But my view is this isn't a bad thing. What we're doing, and much like Emma's example of the bird, is we are supporting those students so that they will have the confidence to then go on and study independently. And by helping them and making them feel safe to begin with, that then gives them that confidence to go from there. And something that Emma and I both feel passionately about is taking a trauma-informed approach. So many of our students have gone through some kind of trauma, whether it be, like I say, through school, whether it be through personal circumstances. And, I have to mention the C word here, but, COVID-19, we're all going through a traumatic time at the moment. We've all lost something, whether it be the ability to study at university the way we thought we would. And by taking a trauma-informed approach, it means that we can think about where our students are, think about how we interact with them, think about what they need. So, for example, things that we think about carefully are things like the importance of relationships. And we spend a lot of the early weeks of our guidance and delivery on the foundation. You're getting to know one another. That's both the students and us as staff. We also get a lot from seeing the students' learning journey, but we talk about our learning journey. A lot of the staff in the foundation year programme, for example, come from non-traditional backgrounds, and Emma and I both do. We're both first in our family to attend university, for example. And we share that with our students, and we don't see that as a sign of weakness or anything. We see that as a sign of strength, and providing them with, modelling behaviour that hopefully lets them know that they do belong at university. And I'll hand over to Emma.
So at the University of South Wales, many academics and many support staff use the Universal Design for Learning. And this came from architecture in the first place, and a focus on design and designing buildings so that they had accessibility in mind from the start, so that people with a range of different needs can have access, rather than having a building designed and then it being adapted for different needs. So this is an area where we're putting more emphasis now in curriculum design. So we're thinking very carefully about how we might engage students, how we might interest them with our curriculum content, but also how we might present that in multiple ways for multiple needs and preferences, and also how we might give choice to our students in the way that they demonstrate their new skills and their new knowledge. And finally, for me, I reflect and I think about my action research and what I'm learning through my teaching in by making art and taking photographs and thinking in that other way. And what we're moving towards really is reflective competence, so that we start to be able to think carefully about what we're doing, think carefully about the changes that we make in classrooms and what we're learning from our students, and then starting to articulate that in different ways so that we know what we know ourselves, but also we can disseminate and share that in the wider university.
Okay, and that's us done. Emma.
Thanks ever so much, Emma and Marie. That was excellent. It was really excellent insight into some of the stories of our students as they come through the higher education system, and a very good reminder. I think it's so important to hear the voice of students and their experiences rather than just seeing them as a kind of sea of faces in front of you in a class, which is the tendency at times. So thanks ever so much for that, and no doubt you're doing lots of really valuable work in relation to the foundation years. I know I'm always grateful for teaching your students that come through your system because they're usually excellently prepared from my point of view. So thanks very much for that. But yeah, so we've got time for five to 10 minutes worth of questions. So again, just to stress, please don't be shy coming forward with the questions. Anyone would like to ask anything of Marie and Emma about their work? Ian's put his actual hand up. Excellent. So, Ian, what would you like to say?
Right, sorry that I left. Schoolboy error, the battery went on my computer. I don't know how to hit the button to put my hand up on it either. What I wanted to say to the two of you is, in my previous role, I worked with a lot of adults that were doing the foundation year through the hub in Ely, and the difference it was making to their lives was, it's just unexplainable. It was fantastic. So all the stuff that you're doing for helping other ones to come through, I really hope you get your PhDs, but even if you don't, keep doing what you're doing because you're changing people's lives. Thank you, girls.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that comment, Ian.
Yeah, again, not to kind of, I'm not very good at blowing my own trumpet, but we do get students who come back to us and tell us it's changed their lives. And without the foundation year, they wouldn't have stuck it out in university. And it was the first time they were told, you do belong here and you are good enough. So yeah, I'm blushing now. I can't say anymore.
And for me, I mean, I work with people as a therapist, and I work clinically for half the week. And the other half of the week, I feel that the role that we do in education is just as healing for people. And education is what got me out of a difficult place when I was in my late teens and early 20s as well. Coming to university was really important for me. So yeah, without getting too kind of emotional about it all, we are learning through our widening participation group at the university how important the stories are of the staff, and how that motivates us to actually believe that education is that transforming thing for people.
Yeah, and much the same as yourselves, a lot of these people, it's the first one in their families to go into this education. So you're inspiring the next generation and the generation after that, because all of a sudden they can see that they are something. Just because for a million different reasons they don't do well in school doesn't mean to say they're not valued members of society. Thank you, girls.
Anyone else? Thanks for that, Ian. Anyone else for any other questions at all? I've got one question. I'm going to abuse my position as chair here. And that is to do with, I mean, it's really important, obviously, to tell the stories in relation to people's individual circumstances in the way that you described. But I'm wondering, I'm sure you would have anticipated this, both of you, but I'm just wondering where wider kind of social dynamics come into play in relation to people's experiences. You know, we all know, for example, that university a lot of the time is a very middle class domain. And so what we have here is also issues around class, as well as other issues, no doubt, about how certain groups, people with disabilities, dyslexia, and the rest, in the way that you're exploring. But I'm just wondering where that fits in relation to the narratives that you're telling, which is about individual personal experiences, and how that fits with the wider social perspective in terms of people's experiences too.
Yeah, I can. It's something that I'm thinking about with my research. Is the idea that non-traditional students need to fit into university life and need to change and adapt to be able to study at university. And one of the things that I'm really interested in, again, is like Emma, kind of a critical pedagogy kind of angle, is why do the students have to change? This idea of a typical student, 18-year-old male, white, middle class, A-level student is becoming a bit of a myth. When you actually look at lots of universities, that isn't the typical student that attends. So why are universities still middle class spaces? We should be, maybe universities need to change to adapt to their cohort rather than the cohorts change to adapt to university. That's one of the things that I've been thinking about as I've been doing my research. I don't know if Emma's got anything to add to
also,
that.
I think through people of various backgrounds coming to university, they often bring so much to the culture and change the university culture, but also take a lot away and make a difference. And they come because they want to bring changes to society. So I think it is individual transformation, but it is also societal transformation in challenging injustice and bringing change, because they're now skilled to do that and more confident and competent in articulating that. So that's, I suppose, the critical pedagogy and the Paulo Freire philosophy comes into contemporary life now.
Sure. Okay, well, thanks ever so much, Marie and Emma. That's great, really interesting paper. And I think what we'll do now is just have a 5-minute break, as I promised. So we've got 6 minutes, actually, according to my watch. So if we come back here at 25 past, and this is where the story goes downhill, because it'll be my paper for the last, going up to 3 o'clock, all right? So if we come back here promptly at 25 past 2, and that will give us 35 minutes, obviously, to work through the paper I'm wanting to present. Okay, thanks ever so much, everybody, and see you back here at 25 past.
Thank you.
So I think we probably better start soonish. James said that he would share this for us. James, are you there? Oh, right, you're there. Okay. Can people put on their videos just for a couple of seconds so we got a rough idea about how many people are back? All right, so we're not doing too bad then, are we? Excellent. Okay. All right. You can turn your videos off now if you want. So, yeah. So the last paper then is my paper. So I'm going to hand over to James now, who's going to chair this last section. All right.
Yeah, so as with the other papers, if there's any questions, please use the chat function, or at the end, stick your hand up and you can ask your questions to Steve. So without further ado, I'll pass it back to Steve for his paper.
Thanks a lot, James. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen with an apology, because some of you would have heard a longer version of this paper at the Lunchtime Wizard seminar series a couple of weeks ago. So if you think, oh no, I don't want to hear that one again, feel free to leave, and it won't be held against you. But basically, yeah, what I wanted to explore was the notion of well-being as related to social participation, obviously, as we've all been doing in the papers, but as it relates to health. And in particular, I'm interested in, as part of a research team at USW, interested in developing a social well-being scale through group concept mapping, which is a particular method which I'll go into in more detail, which will hopefully explore how the social world is perceived by social prescribers. And I'll explain what social prescription is for those who aren't aware of what social prescription is in a moment. But basically what we're trying to do here is get an idea from practitioners, but also service users and others as well that are connected with social prescribing networks, as to what makes up a person's social world, so that we can start developing a sense as to how we might develop a social well-being scale, bearing in mind the different layers there are to the meaning of well-being, and in turn how that relates to people's experiences. So trying to, oh, there we go. That was a bit slow. There we go. So what is group concept mapping? Well, group concept mapping in the first instance is a method for generating ideas about a particular subject or issue, and that subject or issue can be many and varied. And you gather these ideas from a target group, or what you might call a relevant community of participants, which are then analysed through a thorough integration of qualitative and quantitative data techniques. And it's the software that's used for GCM which allows you to do this kind of integration. So there are a number of activities which the target group is invited to engage in. First off, you gain levels of demographic information from the group participants and their engagement in the particular task that you're getting them to consider. And then you ask them to do 3 main tasks, and this task gets generated through the software package, and then, as I say, gets analysed accordingly. But the first main task, and this is the most important task because it provides the foundation for the rest of the analysis, is to produce or brainstorm a list of statements which are related to the particular subject area or issue that you're wanting to explore. The second task is then to start categorizing or clustering these statements under self-defined headings to get a conceptual framework up and running in terms of classifying the different kinds of statements and how they relate to each other. And then thirdly, participants are then invited to rank the statements and the clusters So under these self-defined headings in relation to their importance in the first instance, but there's also other Likert scale indicators that you can use. And this project also used other indicators as well as importance to get a ranking from the participants. Then the GCM software, and there's lots of software around that does this kind of work, but we at the University of South Wales use Group Wisdom. We have a license to use Group Wisdom as a way of group concept mapping, which is a particular software package that's trademarked. But the software then produces various statistical data which analyzes the relationship between the list of statements that are produced from the brainstorming activity, the clusters and the headings, which the statements are then labeled under, as well as the ranking statements as well in terms of their importance to the particular subject or issue that you're seeking to explore. Now, in terms of where we got to in our work, we were seeking to identify social prescribers, which inevitably obviously raises the question, what do we mean by social prescribing? Well, it's a form of non-medical intervention that's designed to enhance health and well-being amongst service users and in particular patients. And so often you'll get social prescribing happening within GP surgeries via what is often referred to as link workers. Now, these link workers engage with patients and they link them with a range of community groups and activities designed to enhance participants' health and well-being. So there's a lot of activities, thinking about some of the papers that were done earlier with Emma's work, for example, around art therapy. There might be art therapy groups, for example, within your community, which then the patient can be referred to through the link worker as a mechanism for engaging the patient in social activities, which then is the idea being that this will then enhance their health and well-being. But of course, there's many other community groups as well, exercise groups, physical groups, games, sport groups, gardening groups, all sorts of different groups that are within the community that the link worker will be attached to and can refer patients to. So in terms of what we were doing in this exercise, because we were focusing on social prescription, we invited a number of participants through the gatekeeper organisations that the Wales School for Social Prescribing Research, which is located in USW, they are very well connected with gatekeeper organisations across the statutory, but also the third sectors as well, who are in some way or another concerned with practicing and promoting social prescribing. Now, they were mainly based in Wales, but there's also from other parts of the UK and internationally as well. So this network of gatekeeper organisations were contacted with the expectation that they will then invite participants to engage in this group concept mapping exercise. So gone the wrong way. So the second step then is to establish how many people will participate. And in relation to this study, 96 people showed an interest. And in the end, we had about 60 or 70 people completing the 3 exercises, with 67 completing particularly the first brainstorming activity, which generated this initial list of statements, identifying what makes up a person's social world. Because what we wanted to do here was try and understand the social worlds in which people occupy as a mechanism for developing this well-being scale, as a kind of first step in developing this well-being scale. We also, as we gathered people who were willing to participate in this group concept mapping exercise, we also broke down their demographic profile. And with the GCM software, you can do this in a range of different ways. And for various reasons concerned with the study and the kinds of things that we were thinking about, we made a distinctions over gender, but also we wanted to identify where people lived in relation to their country. And you can see from the percentages here, most were from Wales, as you would expect. but also there were some others from England, but there was others from the Republic of Ireland, the USA, Australia, Spain, Switzerland, Portugal, etc. So there was a fairly wide representation of different social prescribing practices and people thinking about social prescription from across the globe. 23% of them self-identified as being disabled. We thought it was important to make the distinction between what would be self-defined as disability and non-disability. But also we thought that the type of location as well might be important to this study. So we identified whether they lived in a city, whether they lived in a town, a village, a rural area, or some other kind of context. And again, we were inviting the participants to define this for themselves. We also finally identified the age range, and there was quite a wide age range between 19 and 90 years old. Most of the age group, though, was located between 30 and 60, comprising about half of the participants. And the mean age was 49 years old. So it's skewing slightly towards the older age groups, as often is with these kinds of studies, it has to be said. So next step, so the third step was engaging, getting the participants now. Now we've got a picture of their demographic profile, and we've got a picture, obviously, of the population, the target group that we're seeking to ask this question. We got them then to engage in the first activity, which is the brainstorming activity, which is the foundation really of the group concept mapping exercise. And we generated a list of statements from what is called the focus prompt. And this is the focus prompt we ask people to engage with to try and, as I say, get an understanding of what makes up someone's social world. So the thing we asked was, when I think of the things that have made up my social world over the last year, I include, and of course they're invited to complete that statement. Once we got the statements back from the group, then we use the keywords in context method to review and synthesize the statement list. So compound statements in the first instance were split to clarify exactly what was being said. And that resulted in 462 individual statements. Then duplicates were removed. This is all following Kane and Rosas's method about how to process GCM activities. So duplicates were removed, and that resulted in 207 statements. And then the key words that appeared in the original statements were identified, and each statement then was assigned a code word. So the code word might be sport, outdoors, family and friends, celebrations, community activities, or whatever. Now, each set of statements under the code word were reviewed by us in the research team, and then we synthesized these into statements which shared a similar sentiment or idea. Then we identified in the literature review if there was any additional dynamics to this idea of the social world from the academic literature, and we were able to add 9 more on top. Then the raw and synthesized lists were then shared with the advisory group, which we recruited in part from the initial invitation that was sent out to the gatekeeper organizations. And finally, we settled on a list after we consulted the advisory group. We finally settled on a list which totaled 125 statements, which is, according to the GCM kind of method, it's probably about the maximum amount you can handle in terms of the rest of the exercises associated with this. So we were on then with these 125 statements that have been effectively cleaned through this process of ensuring that the statements were reflecting what was being said, but at the same time was presented in such a way that was keeping the statements down to this about 125 limit that we were working with. So the next step then was activity 2. So once we got all these statements, we then invited the target group to sort them into piles and then provide each pile with a self-defined label. So we wanted to get a sense, in other words, of how you might organize these statements in relation to each other. Now, it's from this sorting process that the software then generates a points map showing where all the 125 statements are in relation to each other. So each point on the map represents a statement, and the proximity of the statements in relation to other statements indicates how frequently the statements were sorted together by the participants. So you don't just get a list, in other words, you get a sense of the relationship between these statements in terms of how they have been grouped together by the participants, which gives an added dynamic to the list of statements that were generated in the first brainstorming exercise. Then the software generates a cluster map to identify how these statements are sorted together under what you might call similar cluster groups or cluster headings. Now, the software gives options, and it gave us options of about 4 to 15 cluster head solutions to the statements. And what the software is doing there is analysing the kind of language that's used, analysing the way in which participants have used their own self-defined labels, and then making calculations in terms of how certain cluster solutions might be produced as a result. So we had 4 to 15 cluster solutions suggested by the software. And then the job of the research team is then to agree a final set of clusters which reflect what's going on in relation to the original list, but also at the same time takes on board how the participants themselves are sorting and classifying these different statements. So we ended up finally agreeing to a cluster map with 6 headings. The first heading is everyday life, activities and pastimes. The second heading was family and friends. The third heading was connecting with others and supporting needs. The fourth heading was community involvement. The fifth heading was engaging with and reflecting on the wider world. And the sixth heading was self-growth and security. Now, the next slide here just gives a taste of some of the examples of the statements which came under each cluster heading. Now, I won't go through all these in detail, but it just gives you a flavour, gives you a bit of flesh, if you like, to the bones of these cluster headings. So under, for example, everyday life, activities and pastimes, we had 29 statements which we grouped under this cluster, but one of them was spending time in nature, in the mountains, etc. Others was organising short breaks on holidays to the countryside, coasts and cities. So that was put under the everyday life, activities and pastimes heading. Family and friends, reconnecting with old friends and letting go of others. And secondly, another statement was regularly talking with friends and family and friends on the telephone. Third was connecting with others and supporting needs. There was 22 statements under this heading. One was creating virtual groups, for example, group message chats on WhatsApp with different groups and communities, virtual book and exercise groups. Another statement under this heading is engaging and socialising with parents at my child's school and activities. Next heading, next cluster is community involvement. So one statement was starting university and meeting new people through societies and classes. Another statement was participating in local community groups, local radio stations, skateboarding community, health driving group, singing group, book club. Fifth heading, engaging with reflecting on the wider world, or somebody put using social media to educate myself on topics such as Black Lives Matter and equality. Another person put thinking about the negative impact of some social interactions such as Facebook. And then finally, we've got the self-growth and security cluster. Being able to make worthwhile plans for myself and my future was one statement. And another example of a statement under this heading is security, for example, in old age, of health, against social exclusion, against racism, against discrimination and harassment. So what we're doing here, as you can see, is developing a picture of the kinds of statements which represented or reflected what this social world looked like for people, but at the same time classifying them under certain headings. Now, you'll notice from these, no doubt, that there will be arguments about where certain statements fitted, but also there's going to be overlaps, obviously, between the statements. And these are sometimes referred to as bridging statements, and that gets captured in the cluster maps, because the closer the statement is to another cluster that they've been put under, then it's obviously indicating that there is an implication of a certain overlap between that statement and what else might be going on in another cluster. So moving on then, just to give you a flavour of the cluster maps that were produced from this second exercise. So you see here from right to left, and I'm not sure how clearly you can see the writing here, but if you take the red one on the right, everyday life activities and pastimes and work clockwise, you can see that the next one round is family and friends. The next one round is connecting with others and supporting needs clockwise, so about 6 o'clock. The next green one going round the clock is community involvement. And then the fifth one is engaging with and reflecting on the wider world, the orange one here. And then you have finally self-growth and security. But these points are representing the statement which has been put under that heading. And then we can see the relationship, as I say, between these statements. So, fifth step, which is activity 3, is getting the participants then to rate and order the statements under each cluster. And this is the final activity. So here participants were asked to rate all 125 statements on a scale ranging from 1 to 5, with 1 as low and 5 as high, on importance and then access and enjoyment. We wanted to capture there this idea of, well, what is the most important part of a social world for the group, but also questions around access, which is obviously really important to social conceptions of well-being, is our ability to access social resources. But also we wanted to get a sense as well as to their enjoyment. So somebody might consider a certain statement as being important and that it's something important to access, but they might not necessarily rate it highly in relation to the enjoyment. So what we're doing here effectively is playing with different conceptions of well-being, recognizing that well-being is a multifaceted concept. So getting down to some of the nitty-gritty in terms of the things that were found, the cluster that was rated the most important and the most accessible was the self-growth and security cluster, interestingly. Family and friends was rated as the most enjoyable cluster. And then conversely, the least important cluster was, for the whole group that is, was engaging with and reflecting on the wider world. And the least accessible cluster was connecting with others and supporting needs. Now, it's important to say, as an important caveat to this, is that when we did this survey July last year, so we were asking them to consider the whole of the year. Obviously, half of that year would have been pre-lockdown and the other half was during lockdown. So it's not surprising that the least accessible cluster was coming up as connecting with others and supporting needs. The least enjoyable cluster, according to the group, was engaging with and reflecting on the wider world. And you've got the ratings there, haven't you, to get a sense of where that's rated in regards to the 1 to 5 scale. So how do we understand these cluster ratings in relation to their pattern match? Well, the software too generates the relationship between the different clusters and gets represented diagrammatically this way. And apologies for the small writing here on the screen, but you'll get a sense as to how this is being represented here. But the main takeaway point, I think, in relation to this slide is to notice that whether we're talking about importance or accessibility or enjoyment, the group tended to place or put the 3 clusters consistently as the top 3 under each of those headings. So when we take order of importance, for example, self-growth and security was considered as the most important. Second was everyday life activities and pastimes. And third was family and friends. When it comes to accessibility, self-growth and security was again rated the highest, then everyday life activities and pastimes, and then families and friends, with that caveat, obviously, that half of this, they were considering the year, as it were, which included a period of lockdown. When it comes to order of enjoyment, though, the order changes a bit, but we've still got those 3 clusters being in the top 3. But order of enjoyment, family and friends comes on top, then everyday life activities and pastimes, and then the third one is self-growth and security. So there's a bit of change of order here. But the important thing is that those 3 clusters seem to be the most prevalent in people's mind under any of those ratings. Now, this is going to be important, obviously, as we develop a social well-being scale, to be very mindful of that when it comes to developing some kind of multiple measuring tool for understanding what's happening here. So the last step then is to consider some of the demographic findings, because the software can also compare the different demographic groups that we identified in the first instance when it came to the target group that we were looking at. The big takeaway point here is that there was a surprisingly, perhaps, high degree of correlation in rating responses in regards to the different groups. There were some subtle differences, marginal differences in many cases, which I'm going to highlight in a moment, but there were no significant big differences, particularly around importance, access, enjoyment, concerning, for example, the demographics of the country a person lived in. There didn't seem to be any difference at all between those groups, or the type of location, so whether it was city, town, village, or other. The latter perhaps is surprising, given you would assume that where you lived in terms of city, town, village, or other, you would expect that to have some kind of impact on the way in which the social world is conceptualized, but it didn't seem to come through in this group. Of course, it's not a massively large group, but it's still perhaps telling us something about the consistency of the understanding of these clusters and how they're viewed. There were, though, relatively marginal differences as related to gender, age, and disability. So when we looked at gender, for example, the R rating, so this is the positive correlation, which the closer it is to 1, the more perfectly correlated it is. So we can see here, can't we, in regards to importance and enjoyment and access, that there, in terms of the whole of the group between men and women, there seems to be a high level of positive correlation between these groups. The biggest difference was between how men and women rated the importance of everyday life activities and pastimes, with women generally seeing this cluster as more important than men. But overall, the correlation is still very strong between them. In regards to age, the mean age of the participants in the study was 49 years. And the ratings of the 3 scales were compared for the participants over and under this age. So that's what we were looking at here. There were no differences in ratings of access and enjoyment at all between the 2 age groups, high levels of correlation between the responses there. However, on the importance scale, it's interesting to note perhaps that participants under 49 years old rated connecting with others and supporting needs and community involvement as more important than those over 49. Whereas people over 49 years rated engaging with and reflecting on the wider world as more important than those under 49. Interesting, not quite sure where it takes us, but it is still nevertheless interesting perhaps to observe these differences in age. Disability, again, is interesting. So there is a high level of correlation between importance, access, and enjoyment between the participants, whether they're reporting as disabled or not. However, the pattern match indicates a slight trend toward lower importance ratings for participants with a disability on the everyday life activities and pastimes and family and friends clusters. Now, a lot of speculation is happening in the research team as to why this might be, especially around access. You would have not expected such a high correlation between issues around access for disabled and non-disabled people for obvious reasons. But there seems to be a high correlation. It may be to do with a kind of leveling down that happened during lockdown. So it may be that all of us, whether disabled or not, we're experiencing low levels of access to, family and friends and all the rest, which was obviously causing problems for people, but it might have skewed the pitch a bit. The other speculative answer to this correlation is perhaps disabled people have reduced their expectations in terms of how they might engage with family and friends and everyday life activities and pastimes, which is an issue that's explored a lot in the philosophy of disability literature for sure. But anyway, just putting it out there really as interesting possible conclusions as to what is going on here. So I'm going to stop now. I realise I'm kind of going over my time a little bit, but our next steps obviously is to start processing this and developing a social wellbeing scale. But back to James, I think, in terms of where we're going with this. So.
Brilliant. Thank you, Steve, for your fascinating paper there. I'll open it to the floor if anyone has any questions they'd like to raise. Bernadette has one, yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'll just put my video on. Hi, thanks, Steve. I actually took part in that study. But yeah, I found the Wisdom software really useful, really easy to use. I really did enjoy that. I was wondering, do you have a figure of how many GPs are actually supportive of social prescribing in South Wales?
We don't. Obviously, that wasn't part of the study. No. But certainly the Wales School for Social Prescribing Research is getting engaged in those kinds of questions for sure in our communication with with our networks. It's a very important question. I mean, obviously, you will get a range of different responses and support one way or t'other in relation to social prescribing. Some GPs are going to be very supportive and others are not, be very medically orientated in terms of their intervention. Yeah, for sure. Yeah,
that's what I found. I approached my GP to introduce something that we're offering in our local community and absolutely no response at all, not interested. So I just wondered about that. But
it's a very good question. I mean, it is something we need to obviously engage with for sure. Absolutely, 100%.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
Brill. And Britt, you're next.
Hello. Thank you very much. My name is Britt Hollingberg. I'm a lecturer in psychology at Cardiff Metropolitan University. And my interests are closely aligned with this in that I'm interested in how young people spend their free time and how that contributes to health and development and well-being. So I was really interested in what first of all, the method I hadn't heard about before. So I found that really fascinating. And it's something I'd love to talk to you about after this in more detail, because I think there's so much potential to explore concepts in this way. But in particular, your findings around the community involvement and the age difference. So you said you had two groups in the median age, and you looked at the difference between those under 49 compared to those over 49 years of age. I was just thinking about like the psychology literature and development and taking like a lifespan approach to people's engagement in community groups and how that kind of presents at different points in life with added responsibilities of childcare and different points. And I was just thinking with the median age, I was just thinking that you might be capturing quite a lot of disparities in where people are in their lives and at what points they have the feasibility of engaging in activities. And had you considered about maybe breaking it down into different age groups a bit more specifically to look at those differences?
Yeah, I mean, we just did that as a kind of crude way of seeing kind of younger, older age groups around the mean was an obvious way to start. We could break it down further. The software would allow you to do that. The issue is, I guess, is that when you get down to the smaller age groups, because the numbers, we're talking only 60 or 70 people, it starts becoming less meaningful. But yeah, absolutely, in terms of your broader point, Britt, I mean, it's absolutely correct that, people's stories are going to be different. And it's interesting to see how their priorities and their ideas about what is important in regards to their social world changes over time, and whether you could make generalizations about that from certain age groups. And that's obviously going to be important in relation to any kind of development of policy or practice in relation to young people versus older people and the rest. And, connects perhaps with some of the themes that James was exploring as well in his paper, because clearly, dementia is going to be tend to affect the older age group. So, I think it's a really important question. Yeah. But we need a bigger group basically to do the work you're doing. But yeah, for sure, in principle, there's no reason why we couldn't.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Brill. And Sally?
A very quick question, because I know we've run out of time. I like the methodological approach, and I think it's interesting comparing between groups, but it'd be really interesting to compare over time. So I don't know whether you're planning to go back, and that will help tell you about well-being in the pandemic, how it's changed over time, whether you revisit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think our task at the moment is to start developing a social well-being scale on the back of what we've found in regards to what makes up people's social worlds and how they rank these aspects. But I think, one, it's important to go back for the reasons you stated in terms of COVID versus, in COVID versus pre-COVID worlds. But I think it's also important to revisit anyway, on the assumption that if we are going to develop a social wellbeing scale, we're going to have to refine it. What I hadn't mentioned in this shorter version of this paper was that we're going to dovetail it alongside the Warwick and Edinburgh mental wellbeing scale. And, most people will probably know, a lot of you here will know that has been refined over the years, and has become a more and more robust tool for measuring mental wellbeing. Our prompt, if you like, came from social prescribers who were saying that although it's helpful to have that as a scale in relation to patients, we also need to be thinking about social wellbeing. But that implies that we would also be refining and going back to revisiting, if you like, the study and working on it, presumably a number of years, around how we conceptualize social wellbeing in a way that's meaningful and captures the nuances that are out there in terms of how people conceptualize their social worlds, which obviously is complex and varied. Thanks. That's previous. I think we've run out of time.
I think that's bang on 3.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thanks for James for handling the questions there. I don't want to keep up people's times, obviously, because we want to be finishing, obviously, but I just want to reiterate again, thank you so much to the paper deliverers. It feels like a real tangible result that's come out of the dialogues we've had in USW around wellbeing research, which is great. But also thanks ever so much for all your questions. And just to reiterate again, it's in the chat as well. Get back in touch with Chloe. She will get you in contact with me if you're interested in joining the Wizard Wellbeing Network. It's important to emphasize that as well. This is the kind of launch pad for that particular network, which we're going to go forward with, hopefully. So I think that's it, is it? We say goodbye, do we? Meet another day virtually somewhere. Okay, so I'm just going to wave now. It feels always really awkward what you do at this point, doesn't it? But I'm going to wave. Excellent. Thanks ever so much, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.